Hi, good morning, everyone, and sorry for the slight delay in starting up this morning. We're now ready to go. Welcome to the GPE webinar series. My name is Stuart Cameron. I'm the Equity and Inclusion Thematic Lead at the Global Partnership for Education. I'm here at the GPE Secretariat in Washington, DC, joined by my colleagues in the GPE webinar team. And we're also joined by a wonderful panel of experts joining us online who I'll introduce shortly. GPE's webinars started in 2016. They're part of GPE's Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Initiative that came about as a response to GPE's partner countries' request for additional opportunities to exchange knowledge, good practice, and policy approaches that inform education policies and practices at the country level. The webinar also gives practitioners the opportunity to engage in a continuous practice of knowledge exchange between partner countries, which in turn strengthens and fulfills the national and global objectives of GPE. This particular webinar is the fourth in a series that is focusing on collecting and using data on marginalized groups for education. This series is tackling issues such as how to identify disability and measure inclusive learning environments, the role of community and citizen-led initiatives, and the use and limitations of new technologies in gathering better data. Our main aim with this is to convene key partners working on these issues and to foster collaborations that can hone and apply new ideas. So before we begin this session, I'd like to draw attention to a few housekeeping items. Firstly, if you're facing connection issues, please let us know via email. And the email address is webinars@globalpartnership.org. We'll have a question and answer session after the presentation, so feel free to keep sending your questions throughout the webinar via the YouTube live chat feature or by email. And that's at the same email address, webinars@globalpartnership.org. We'll try to get as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. Please do let us know your name, your organization, and the name of the presenter or speaker to whom the question is directed. This session is also being recorded. We'll send everyone participating today resources associated with the webinar and a link to the recorded session. And we also have live captions or subtitles in English for today's session. And you should be able to see the link to the page where you can watch the video with live captions underneath. In your invitation, and we'll post that link in the comments box on YouTube as well. So today's session is about using findings from the Girls' Education Challenge to understand issues of gender and disability in developing countries and how we can make education systems more inclusive. The Girls' Education Challenge is a fund launched by the UK Department for International Development in 2012 as part of a 12-year commitment to reach the most marginalized girls in the world. A key component of GEC is the collection of data for project monitoring and evaluation that also provides wider insights into educational access, learning, and inequalities. The GEC projects have collected extensive information on access to education and learning among children with disabilities in particular. And in this session, we're going to be hearing about the importance of disaggregated data for marginalized groups of girls and how it can be used to make education programs more inclusive, with cases of the Girls' Education Challenge projects in Zimbabwe and Kenya. This is a topic of great interest for GPE because, as we've highlighted in the previous sessions in this series, equity and inclusion is at the heart of our vision of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. GPE also supports the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which most GPE partner countries are also signatories to, in particular in its insistence that governments must ensure that children with disabilities are not excluded from the general education and can access an inclusive, quality, and free primary education and secondary education on an equal basis with others in the communities in which they live. And among our commitments at the Global Disability Summit in 2018, GPE committed to support improvements on data and disability at the country and global level in partnership with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. Now, allow me to introduce our presenters and discussants today. First of all, Engineer Mike Matungi is the founder and CEO of I Choose Life Africa. He sits on the boards for several organizations and is also the former immediate chairman of health NGO Network, founding and Ebertech Engineering Company Limited. He has a passion for development and has designed programs around health, education, economic empowerment, leadership and governance, as well as institutional strengthening for over 20 years. He's the author of the leadership's book, Kenya Mpya, Holding National and Country Leaders to Account. That is a blueprint on country transformation through visionary leadership and citizen engagement. He has a passion for strategic
Sir,
planning.
would you mind slowing down a little bit? Thank you. The interpreter
Okay.
here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'll slow down. He has a passion for strategic planning and has overseen the development of strategic plans in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Lorraine Wapling is a trained teacher by profession who has 20 years experience working in the development sector, focusing on the promotion of disability inclusive development. Lorraine has been a senior disability expert for the DFID-funded Girls Education Challenge program since 2017. As a consultant, she has undertaken assignments for a number of prestigious international agencies and non-governmental organizations, including DFID, Australian Aid, the UN, and the EU, focusing on inclusive programming predominantly in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Mbuso Jama is a dynamic and enthusiastic professional with 16 years of experience in humanitarian and development work, spanning across the UK, Africa, and Asia. He has extensive experience in program planning, research, management, monitoring and evaluation, and impact measurement. He works for World Vision as the Senior Impact Advisor, focusing on designing MEL and impact measurement systems for large and complex multi-sector programs, and is the technical MEL lead for the DFID-funded GEC transition program in Zimbabwe. Teresa de Sousa has 20 years of experience in humanitarian and development work across several countries in Africa and Latin America as an experienced senior program manager and country representative. She is a strategic thinker with proven ability to developing innovative strategies for adaptive management and new business development, leading to long-term sustainability. She currently works for World Vision UK as a program manager for iGate, Improving Gender Attitude Transition Education, which is a 4-year project implemented in Zimbabwe. Frederick Haga is the Acting Director of Special Needs Education in the Kenyan Ministry of Education. He led the technical committee that steered the review of the National Special Needs Education Policy Framework of 2009, resulting in the sector policy for learners and trainees with disabilities. Fred has extensive experience as a teacher, curriculum developer, and an education manager. Fred had several leadership roles within the disability rights movements for more than 23 years, including the National Development Fund for Persons with Disabilities, African Union of the Blind, and the World Blind Union. Daniel Mont is the co-president of the Center for Inclusive Policy and an international expert in disability and development. As a senior economist with the World Bank for 10 years, he was also the chair of the Analytical Working Group of the UN Statistical Commission's Washington Group on Disability Statistics, and currently serves on several of their working groups. He is also a member of the UN's Expert Group on Monitoring and Evaluating Disability and Development, and has worked with UNICEF, ILO, UNESCAP, UNESCWA, DFID, and DFAT, advising on inclusive policy implementation. Ian Atfield is a senior education advisor for DFID in South Asia, based in Nepal with a focus on the GEC. He has worked extensively with DFID for 12 years in various roles and led significant education policy work in various capacities and in different parts of the world, including Nigeria and Tanzania. Leading the inclusive education work stream of the 2018 Global Disability Summit, coordinating new programmatic commitments and private sector engagement are some salient features of his work. He also has experience in education data systems design, mapping, learning assessment, and M&E. So with that, I'll pass over to Lorraine Wapling, who is going to start us off with the first presentation today. Lorraine.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just check that the sound is okay. Is that coming through okay?
We can hear you, yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So good morning to everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, to GPE for providing this forum, and my greetings to all my GEC colleagues. So my job really is to set the scene, I think. So I'm going to provide some quite general information around what the GEC has been doing linked to disability disaggregation, and then I'll be able to pass on to my colleagues who've got some fascinating case studies where they sort of interrogate the data in a little bit more detail. So if I could have the next slide, please. I go to the next slide. Okay, so just the introduction. So I think we can go to the next slide. No, sorry. If we could go back to it will be the third slide, I think. That's the one. That's great. Okay, there's a difference between the webinar and the presenter timing. So, okay. So basically, the GEC, as has already been said, was launched in 2012, 12-year commitment, and we're looking at being able to support the most marginalized girls around the world to help transform their lives through quality education and learning opportunities. So we could have the next slide, please. At the moment, we've currently got 41 projects running in 17 countries. That's split between projects which are called GEC Transition projects, which are the original GEC programs which have been taken on as the girls have progressed through education. The cohorts are being supported GEC Transition funding, and then we have a new funding window, relatively new, called Leave No Girl Behind. So in total, the whole, we have 41 projects running now in 17 countries, which obviously means that there's significant opportunity for looking at data. So next slide, please. So what we're going to look at is what can we do with that data? So how has data disaggregation driven innovation within the GEC? So next slide, please. So in terms of disability itself, disability is what I describe as being a sticky problem when it comes to programming. Basically, what we know is that there is a lack of data around people with disabilities. So that lack of data has inevitably led to a sort of invisibility of people with disabilities in most mainstream programming. Also, we know that disability from a rights-based perspective, whilst that is changing, awareness is growing, it's still quite poorly understood in terms of mainstream development. So there's still a tendency to think that disability is a specialist area that most mainstream programs don't need to worry about. And a third area, which is also of interest, is that disability can often be treated as a sort of homogeneous issue, imagining that disabled adults and children all experience the same thing without sort of really understanding the intersectional nature that disability has on people's whole lives. So really, we have this massive knowledge gap, essentially, because there's generally a lack of documented experience in relation to disability inclusion. And the outcome of that really is there's, I think, an underestimation around the impact that disability has on all of our development outcomes. Next slide, please. So give you a bit more background to what we've done in the GC in terms of data disaggregation. Two really important things that we did from the beginning of the GEC transition program was, firstly, we made sure that we defined disability from a rights-based perspective and made that applicable to all projects. So that is across the board for GEC transition and LNGB programs. So we made it very explicit how we define disability, so that we were not leaving the definition of disability up to chance. And secondly, and this is the most important thing for this seminar, is that we required all GEC projects to collect disability prevalence data from their school and household survey processes. And we made sure that they used the Washington Group questions within those surveys, and they are required to collect that information at baseline, midline, and endline. So for the GC transition programs, we required them to use the short set, but for LNGB, the Leave No Girl Behind, we have basically introduced the child functioning question set, so which is slightly more detailed, especially for girls who are younger. Data on disability then is disaggregated by each of those projects, by domains of functioning and by levels of difficulty, and that happens at each of those data collection points. So we have this body of data around disability prevalence, around domains of functioning, and around the levels of difficulties for all of the projects that are taking part in GEC, which is amazing. And finally, just to sort of note that what we have also done is made sure that we provided ongoing technical assistance, and that's both to the evaluation teams and to the program teams. And we've done that through one-to-one sessions, webinars, written guidance. That's been really, really important. So next slide, please. What we found in terms of what information has come out so far from the GEC transition project, so the 23 original GCT projects, we have been able to analyse their baseline data, and we found, interestingly, an 8.9% prevalence rate using the standard cutoff point for disability. So that was an interesting finding. When we looked at that in a little bit more detail, we found that the modal rate, the most common prevalence rate reported by individual projects, was between 1 and 3%. So what happens is, because some of our projects were deliberately targeting girls with disabilities, and so had the majority, or if not all, of their cohort of girls with disability, it pushed the overall prevalence rate up. But if we took those projects out, or we looked at the modal rates of disability, it came up between 1 and 3%, which I think is fairly good, perhaps. And it is a fairly interesting finding, and pretty significant, because most of these GCT projects did not deliberately target girls with disabilities. So this came as a little bit of a surprise to many projects. The graph that you can also see there gives us a little bit, another interesting dimension to the data that we're just sort of working through, is what happens when you change the cutoff point from the standard cutoff, which includes can't do and have a lot of difficulty. If you include the category of some difficulty, then you get a much wider, much greater prevalence rate. That's of interest, I think, specifically in education terms, because it's probable that even with some difficulty, some of the girls in classrooms might be experiencing barriers. So that's something to explore a little bit further later. Next slide, please. So what did this sort of the impact of disability disaggregation have on programming? Well, it was remarkable, actually. What happened is it absolutely stimulated and prompted very high levels of engagement from projects around how do we go about making sure that girls with disabilities are able to participate. So we provided lots of advice and support to projects as they explored different ideas for around accessibility and inclusive approaches, which my two colleagues will talk about in much more detail. and also prompted a lot of discussions about the difference between, impairment-specific support and barriers, which was really, really interesting. So next slide, please. Some of the common program strategies that were employed by projects so far have been a wide selection. Things like community awareness projects, lots of staff training for staff and partners on disability inclusion, lots of work on teacher training, improving inclusion practices, linking with disabled people's organisations was very common. Also, some were able to make some school adaptations, some physical infrastructure adaptations. Some have been looking at specific coaching support for teachers. Some have been targeting support for specific girls with disabilities. And then a larger number have been looking at their own monitoring systems. So projects have been incorporating more questions and information around disability into their monitoring systems, which is great when we think about the lack of evidence that we have. And then a few projects have also been doing some specific advocacy, which is fantastic. Next slide, please. So some of the issues that we were dealing with have sort of changed. So in the early days, as projects were just getting started with disability disaggregation and the implications that the data was showing them, we had some very, very basic questions coming up to us about, well, some projects had their own way of defining disability, and then we were asking them to collect questions using the Washington Group, and they weren't the same questions. So we were having differences in assumed prevalence rates, which was very interesting. There were questions around whether the Washington Group questions were diagnosing disabilities and whether that would place girls in a situation of discrimination and stigma. So we talked a lot in terms of both of those questions. We talked a lot around how to resolve them. Firstly, in terms of using the Washington Group, we questions where some projects had their own definitions. What we were able to say is, well, if you want to keep your own definitions, that's fine from a project implementation point of view, but from a prevalence rate and from a monitoring perspective, then we need to keep the Washington Group's questions as they are. We need that information. So some projects are running both of those, which is interesting. It hasn't caused any specific problems. We have been very clear to stress at all points when we're coming into contact with projects and programs that Washington Group questions simply give you a prevalence rate. They do not diagnose disability. So projects that want to get to understand disability and girls with disabilities that they have in their cohorts, we encourage them to do much more specific disability questionnaires, follow-ups to actually really understand the barriers that the girls are facing in accessing the services that they're providing. And also, there was a lot of initial kind of fear that, we don't have any money for assistive devices and medical interventions, and we don't do disability. So we had a lot of discussions and webinars around how mainstream programs can use the data to help them understand how to make their existing activities accessible, and my colleagues will about that. The longer that we've gone through this process, the more nuanced issues are beginning to emerge now, which is really interesting. We're now in a situation where we're helping the system really, and particularly parents and girls with disabilities themselves, to make more demands on the system for more joined up services. So the projects themselves, haven't been encouraging projects themselves to provide things like assistive devices, but we have been encouraging them to ensure there's a link up of services so that girls with disabilities can access things like assistive technology And if it's not available, then it's helping to push that demand to make these kind of things available, which is interesting. Another issue we're coming up against is setting learning benchmarks and suitable testing methodologies which you can use for children with and without disabilities. The validity of having systems where you're disaggregating then by disability status, whether or not the tests are equitable and fair. And so we're having very interesting discussions about that, and also around progress, because people have not studied the learning outcomes of girls with disabilities, specifically in this context, before. We don't really have any benchmarks for what would be a successful level of progress. So we're just kind of working out what this kind of data is telling us. And also then thinking about what's happening to girls who have quite severe impairments. So looking at the prevalence data, we might see that there are definitely fewer girls with very severe impairments in the cohorts. Now, does that mean that there simply aren't that many girls? Does that mean that they're not in school? What is happening to girls with more severe impairments? Are they still being turned away or being transferred to other types of education? So that's another thing that we're just trying to explore. Also, a really big question is about how to support girls with disabilities, particularly with more significant disabilities in large school populations. So you've got very many kids in your classrooms. How do you support them appropriately? This is an ongoing discussion. And then very
Lorraine,
can
recently, I interrupt you briefly? I'm sorry to interrupt. I just had a request from a translator to our school presenters just to speak a little more slowly because the translator is not able to keep up with them. Sorry to interrupt. Please carry on.
Yep. Okay. So
Thank you.
In terms of LNGB, so Leave No Girl Behind, then very recently, because we asked them to use the child functioning questions, which are a slightly more detailed question set, we're seeing an interesting rise in the numbers of children showing up with more mental health difficulties. And so this is leading to some, going to lead, I think, to some very interesting conversations. So I think I'll leave that there. I think there's going to be opportunity for questions and answers later. So I hope I've been able to give you a little flavour of what's to come with my colleagues, who will now be able to go into much more depth about the implications for them as project implementers for this data disability disaggregation.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. That's a great start to the session. So now I'll hand over to Mbuso for the second presentation today. Mbuso.
He has to unmute himself.
Mbuso, I think you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Yeah, so greetings, everyone. And yeah, thank you for participating in this webinar. So I'm going to share a case from one of the GEC projects in Zimbabwe. That's the IGET project, and how we have used disability data to adapt the program within the context of Zimbabwe. Next slide, please. So this slide here, just to give you a bit of context in where the project is and scale as well. So we are part of the Transition Challenge GC program, and we started in 2017, ending in September 2021. So we're working in 318 schools, which is a mix of primary and secondary schools. And we've been moving with these schools since 2013. And it's also part of a quasi-experimental study where we are tracking 37 IGET schools and 37 comparison schools. As part of the theory of change, there are 3 outcomes that we are looking at, and these are learning, transition, and sustainability. And in terms of the context where we are working in, I just put a typical girl in Zimbabwe there, where there are 1 in 2 girls are most likely to go to bed hungry, or get married early, walk about 2 hours to school. And in addition to those barriers that you face, there is girls with disabilities, and they have an added layers of stigma and discrimination that they experience as well. And as we work around this, we are also cognizant that the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education in Zimbabwe has sort of like a department that deals with the special education and disability as well. That's the social department. Next slide, please. Then in terms of the context in Zimbabwe, I just want to highlight that we have sort of like the foundational pieces already in place. It's one of those where policy and legislation are in place, but there is a gap when it comes to availability of data and also interventions to respond to the needs of the persons with disabilities. So there's no processes available in place, even for collecting national data on disability. And we all know that sort of like creates a gap between, policy and implementation. And partly we're trying to reduce that gap by trying to gather data. So we did our baseline in 2017 using the Washington Disability Group, a short set of questions. And we're working with a sample size of around 3,036 girls. We had a very small sample of boys as well, but that was quite small to understand the gender aspects of it. But mainly I'll be speaking more of girls who are the main target groups of the intervention. And what I can highlight in the slide is that we found a prevalence rate of around 10% for the whole sample. And this was in comparison to the national data, which had about 2% prevalence. And so that's one of the, I think, interesting findings that we had at that point. And secondly, also, we asked the same questions to the caregiver and also the girls. Most of them were quite, above the age of 12, so we could administer the questions to them. And the prevalence rates were the same, they were similar. So that's something interesting as well. So that boosted our confidence in terms of the reliability of the data. And then looking at the data as well, we found out that the categories that were more common were mainly the cognitive impairment. And in Washington Group, usually when you talk of cognitive impairment, we are looking at asking questions around remembering and concentration. Next slide. As it has been already presented, so this slide is just to show you we are using EGRA, early grade reading assessment and early grade mathematics assessment as our learning outcomes. And these are the different subtasks in terms of the averages. And what I want to present here is that this is the snapshot of the whole sample. We found out that there were some subtasks that were performed quite low by everyone else. both in literacy and numeracy. And also in terms of analysis, what we are also looking at is very low foundational skills for literacy and numeracy for even the upper grades were performing probably at a very low level. This is before disaggregation. And just to give you a highlight in terms of, we're already dealing with challenges of low literacy and numeracy. And to add as well, where we work in, we went for the most marginalized schools. So out of all the schools that we had, we selected the ones with the highest in terms of the, where we took the lowest pass rates, the ones that were in remote rural areas. So we are dealing with the most marginalized schools and communities. Next slide. This is now the disaggregated data. So when we compare learners with disability and the overall sample, you will find out that, for example, if you look at the whole average for literacy, you can see the 39.1%. But if you look at learners with cognitive disabilities, they are 8.1 percentage points below the average. So that's quite significant. And same applies to numeracy. They are 7.5% below the average. And these findings were statistically significant. And what happened as well is looking at different predictors for learning outcomes, the strongest predictor was actually disability. And that was also striking to us in terms of how then do we revisit the theory of change and our design to make it more sensitive and responsive to the needs that we are finding on ground. So cognitive disability and hearing were the significant contributors when it came to literacy and numeracy scores. Next slide. So having the findings at baseline, the next task was to how then do we use the data to further refine the design of the project. And just to add that as part of GEC, we have a number of feedback loops when it comes to adapting the project. So we have the small cycle feedback loops where we meet on a quarterly basis to discuss and agree on what is data or what evidence have we gathered that can warrant us changing the design of the project. And then we have the bigger feedback loops that happen when we have such studies like the baseline and the midline and the end line. So using this opportunity, we then set and looked at what is it that we can do to be able to respond to these high prevalence rates that we have found. And we came up with 3 categories of sort of like responses and one of them was the low cost or no cost. So cost was sort of like the driver in terms of the this adaptation. And then we had the medium cost and high cost interventions. And typically the low cost would entail us working within the existing budget, either it's training or tweaking whatever plans we have to make sure that we still respond to the needs. And the medium cost as well were specifically targeting individuals, and the high cost were more of those transformative twin track approaches where you do something for everyone and also deal with the learners with disabilities. So at the bottom there, I tried to show what we did. So we managed to do, in terms of content, we managed to make it more sensitive, gender sensitive, and also disability sensitive as well. When it came to teachers, we also trained the teachers in terms of awareness and also being able to identify learners and help them rearrange the sitting arrangements so that those that cannot see can come and sit closer to the board. And also the issue of remembering and concentration. We have a school feeding program which is done by the government, and then we had to sort of like complement in terms of providing resources there. And we also having World Bicycle Relief. So we had to refine our targeting for bicycles so that girls from further distances can get bicycles. So we invested on training and awareness for staff and also the teachers, that's the stakeholders that we have, and also improved on our generation of evidence. Next slide. This slide here, the first top bit is really to show you that there is a double burden for learners with disability. Looking at the 2 points there, learners with disability are likely to feel less safe when it comes to traveling to school, and also they have high chores at home, so they don't have time to study or do other things. And that is reflected in the one of the outcomes that I showed at the bottom there, which is the transition outcomes. So when it comes to transition within GEC, we're looking at a combination of progression grade to grade, as well as moving from one level of education, that's primary to secondary. And when we did our baseline, we did not use or have any historical data to be able to set proper benchmarks. So as a result, we used just the 2 previous years to understand transition. And we found out that at baseline, our prevalence rates were so high. They were around 94% for both the treatment and the comparison schools. So it meant that there was a high likelihood of either those numbers going down because we just used the snapshot. So the transition outcome measurement was more like retention rather than the progression upwards because the figures were already high. So looking at the group where we are working in, transition decreased by 4 percentage points, whereas for the learners with disability, it decreased by 7 percentage points. So that's also just to show how affected the girls with learners with disability are. Next slide. This one is also looking at the ultimate learning outcome, which is the literacy and numeracy. I think what here I just want to emphasize we are using standardized data. So what you should concentrate more on is the movement from baseline to midline. That's 2017 to 2019. Overall, you look at the literacy, the overall group moved by 0.3 standard deviation compared to the learners with disability that only moved by 0.12 standard deviation. So the same was also observed for numeracy. And what we are then realizing is that there is marginal gains for learners with disability compared to the overall group. And of course, anecdotally, we haven't done a deep dive really because of the sample that's available. The caution also is it's a small sample, but we are realizing that there is a Matthew effect where those that are starting low are finding it difficult to have more learning gains, and typically that's learners with disability. And then also reflecting this on the adaptations that we did, we also realizing that there is still more work to be done. And looking at the investment that we put in there, which was, I think, good investment, looking at it's also always a good starting point to raise awareness and also set up systems to be able to capture more data. But what we are learning then is probably a more targeted at individual level sort of like approaches and twin track approaches will yield better gains. Next slide. So what lessons have we learned overall when it comes to the data that we have and distilling all the evidence that we have? So we are realizing that availability of data on disability is still a big challenge. Although we have, where like in Zimbabwe, the country is party to the CRPD in 2013, which sets a good platform in terms of generating data, but there is still lack of national data when it comes to disability. The census is done only after 10 years, and the only data source for disability at a national level is the intercensal data, which is done after 5 years. And then when it comes to also disability planning, I think one of the lessons we're learning is that it's always important to, when you're doing the context analysis and doing everything else, to begin setting the foundations on how you respond to disability. We did a comprehensive context analysis, but to be honest, trying to capture disability, I think more people were more, in terms of gathering the data, we couldn't get much data on disability without having sort of like set up processes to be able to capture it. And also there's also limited funding. We are seeing that still the government is not responding adequately. There's still some gaps in terms of funding and still from the donors as well. It's something that we need to generate evidence that some of these interventions do work. And it's always difficult when you want to, in the middle of the project, to say, let me start seeing how we can respond to disability. The other thing is that we are using the project really to, we have shared this evidence across many platforms and just to raise awareness and also try and engage DPOs and donors to seek for additional funding to support the project. At a national level, we are still packaging the data so that we have enough sort of like quantum of evidence to be able to engage the ministry at a national level. But at a local level, we are jointly now monitoring schools and with the district inspectors, still capturing some of this disability data. And then as a project, we have improved in terms of all our monitoring tools now have the Washington Group set of questions, so that we, even if we collect data at a community level rather than at a school level, we're able to capture good data when it comes to disability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to remind everyone that we are taking questions through the YouTube chat box. We already have a number of great questions there, so please keep those questions coming and we will address them at the end. So now let's move on to the third presentation today. That's with Mike. Over to you, Mike. Okay, sorry everyone. It seems that we don't currently have Mike Mutungi on the line. So what I suggest, because we're running a bit behind time anyway, so I have a, okay, so cover for this one.
Okay, good evening everyone. It's evening in Kenya, so
okay.
I hope everybody's having a good time. So we'll share our learning journey on social inclusion, and this is a program in Kenya that works across 3 counties. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'll tell you a story about Rachel. Rachel is a Form 3 student at Bishop Lawi School. She's an orphan with visual impairment. and she struggled through mainstream education. She eventually dropped out just because she couldn't cope. Fortunately, she was able to join.
We don't hear the speaker anymore, says the interpreter. Yeah, we've lost the speaker.
Hi, can I ask anyone else who's on the WebEx to mute? And Dennis, I think you were speaking. Can you try speaking again, please?
Mike was, when he was speaking, maybe it was from the Dennis.
Do we have Mike or Dennis on the line? And are you able to speak at the moment? I think we're having some connection.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
This is Mike. I don't know whether you can hear me from Kenya.
We can hear you now. Yeah, I think we lost you for a minute there, Mike. Please carry on. Okay, Mike, I'm afraid we can't hear you at all, so I think we might have to move on to the discussion. Ian Atfield has offered to cover, so perhaps perhaps we go to Ian Atfield. Ian, are you there?
There's someone who's responding with someone.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Okay, let's try again. Can you hear me now?
Okay, we can hear you. We can hear you, Mike. Can you hear
Mike,
us?
allez-y, est-ce que vous entendez?
Just close this. Okay, so I'll tell you a story about Rachel. Rachel is a girl who was in a program in a school called Bishop Lawi. She's an orphan, and she had a
Apologizing,
vision
but we have
impairment.
interference on the line.
Yeah.
I think the interference is better now. Can you carry on, Mike?
Okay.
I am sorry about the technical hitches we're having, everyone. Ian, if you're there, I think the problem is that Mike can't hear us as well. So perhaps, Ian, you could cover the presentation because we're having various technical problems when we try to connect to Mike.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And Mike, sorry that you're having so many problems joining from Kenya. I think everybody would have had a chance to really, everybody will already have read Rachel's story, which has been on screen for a while. This really helps to show the journey, the progression of one individual student who was struggling, fell out of school with a vision impairment. At that point, the I Choose Life program did manage to intervene, raise awareness around the schools about how important disability mainstreaming was, and really that enabled her to make this successful transition back to school. And that is a story that is now being replicated in 19 other schools that are being supported in Kenya. Next slide. So as one of the GCT programs, as others have mentioned, I think from Zimbabwe, disability wasn't in the original design of the I Choose Life program. You can see the parameters here, working in 3 counties with over 10,000 marginalized girls in 60 schools. A lot of the data looking at the disaggregated data showed that there were significant numbers of orphans, young mothers, girls coming from a female-headed household and living in poverty, but there wasn't a specific disability criteria in the targeting. With the next slide. Back on. So the baseline survey that was undertaken did find, again, something that was typical, as we saw from Lorraine's presentation, around 3.8% disability prevalence. And clearly these were in the 6 core domains of the Washington group, where the disability was considered an impairment that was significant enough to cause a functional difficulty or issue for the girls. Next. So there you can see the breakdown of the baseline, where very high rates of orphans in Kenya, 30% single, 14% double. Not that many young mothers, but very high rates of poverty, and also different languages spoken at home to the language of instruction. But certainly that was enough to identify to the project that they needed to start to make adaptations to support girls with disabilities. Next slide. So coming from the baseline recommendations, there was clearly a need to start doing active participation to identify the support these individual girls needed. There was work with the assessment and resource centres, which is a network of district education facilities that are available in Kenya to try to support with interventions, and also deliberately to try to track the learning and the transitions of girls with disabilities as they progressed up through grades and between schools. Next slide. So coming down to the organisational response from I Choose Life, that they first looked about trying to extend their learning from other Girls Education Challenge peer projects, which fortunately in Kenya included, I think, Leonard Cheshire Disability, which obviously has a lot of expertise in this area. And they really needed to look and do a more in-depth situation analysis, both around this continuum of functional impairment and how severity of disability can be supported in reality in some of the schools. They were trying to see what common functional impairments cropped up across the 3 very different geographic areas, some in the northern arid zones of Kenya, some in parts of the urban Greater Nairobi, and to really find out who can be supported once more detailed functional assessments of needs had been conducted at these education assessment and resource centres. So there's the sort of approach from our I Choose Life, which is obviously also being supported by the broader disability expertise within the Girls' Education Challenge. Next slide. So in terms of sort of key programmatic responses, one was this thing about the sort of child-to-child awareness, so that children were aware of one another's children that had impairments and how to support them. Getting the teachers aware that they actually had children with functional impairments and how they could be supported was key. A number of schools made structural modifications, some relatively minor, handrails, adaptations to toilets, ramps that would enable in particular access with mobility. Some of the school committees, both around gender and inclusion, were stepped up to see how they could support, and a broader wrap of community advocacy. Next slide. And certainly, this process hasn't been straightforward. There's been a number of challenges. You do come up again and again to deep-rooted attitudinal barriers, beliefs that children are, for example, have been cursed, related to witchcraft, that there's no point in educating girls and children with disabilities. Often the infrastructure was lacking to enable access, in addition to problems with transport and actually getting to the schools. Many teachers feel a lack of confidence of their ability to support and handle learners with disabilities. And obviously schools lack resources as well as expertise in implementing inclusive education. There's also, I think, a realise that sometimes you do need that extra time and commitment and patience to work. And clearly groups such as learners with cognitive impairments may well, not progress at a significantly high rate, even with support. There's that sort of concept about being able to realise one's full promise, and that may vary considerably between individuals. Next slide. So overall, I mean, seeing some of the achievements have come over this period of the last 2 to 3 years. So as I said, there's been, quite a, following on from the stakeholder assessment, there's been, a significant volume of teacher training, specifically around inclusion completed. There's detailed mappers of the learners with different disabilities who were identified. Structural modifications coming in following the disability sensitive infrastructure audit. The committees within schools looking at gender equality and social inclusion have really helped to sort of change and shift attitudes in schools. And for some individuals, there have been this transition of path, a transition from the academic into a technical and vocational education stream. This is the picture you can see on the left of the slide. Thank you. And so again, just sort of rapidly seeing how these sort of pathways or factors that have contributed to success, it's very much taking this sequential approach, which I think it really matches some of Lorraine's first presentations about focusing on identifying the barriers to an inclusive or enabling environment to learn, and the structural, institution, attitudinal barriers that are commonly seen. Forming committees using that information and awareness to try to see how disability inclusive programming can be introduced. And then finally doing this sort of targeted participation with both mainstream activities that benefit everybody, but then specific support to individuals with specific impairments where it's needed. This is an approach that certainly I Choose Life have taken, and I think is one which broadly mirrors many of the other GEC transition projects that are operating across Africa and Asia. And I think that's the last slide. Are we finished there? Yeah, thank you. And as I would say, I mean, and apologies that Mike and his team weren't able to present it. He would have added a lot more, I think, colour and nuance than I was able to. But of course, there were those technical difficulties. So handing back to you now, Cameron.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks very much for stepping in and covering. And we're very sorry that we weren't able to get Mike's voice and his more nuanced understanding of the project. What I will suggest now, because of the technical problems, we're running a little bit over time. We will extend the session till 10:40 for those who are able to stay a bit longer, and that gives us just under half an hour. So I'd like to invite a response from our discussants now. So we've got three discussants, Frank Hager, Dan Mont, and Ian. And if I would ask if you could very kindly limit your responses to about 3 minutes, that would be great, so that we still have time for questions at the end. So with that, if Frank is on the line, could we go to you for an initial... Sorry?
Fred. It's not Fred.
Oh, Fred, sorry. If Fred is on the line, could we go to you for the first of the responses? Fred Hager, sorry for getting your name wrong.
Hello?
Hello, Fred, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. Good evening from Nairobi. I hope I have better luck than my countrymate, Mike. I've listened to the three presentations, and what is clearly demonstrated is the importance of data around disability. And while the two presentations, especially from Zimbabwe and Kenya, focus on specific projects that have taken advantage of information that's available, I just want to talk about a bit of the general Kenyan experience. And I have to give credit to Daniel Mont, who's, I think, speaking later on this, because I think he's an authority in this area, and I've listened to him talk about data, and I'm applying that to the Kenyan situation. In Kenya, we are really used to having information, especially quantitative information, about the number of children, either in school or out of school. But we are learning that this does not really tell the whole story if we just focus on the quantitative data. And even that quantitative data, sometimes the way it's obtained, the approach that is used, sometimes doesn't quite also give all the details. And that's why I want to agree with Daniel, because he said this before elsewhere, that it's very important also to get qualitative data, because only then will you get a better picture of the information that you need, especially when addressing disability issues, and especially informed by data that is available. Kenya recently had a census, and for the first time, the country is using the Washington Group set of short questions modified to fit a census situation. And we are anxiously waiting to see how that comes out. But I work for the Ministry of Education, and we have learned to try and expand the education management information system, because only then will we be able to include in our planning and in our interventions specific considerations that are sensitive to disability issues in the education system. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. So now we'll go to Dan Mont. Dan, are you on the line?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me. I'll try to keep this to 3 minutes. First, I want to agree with, in particular, with one thing Lorraine said about looking at the range of difficulty. There's a lot of talk goes into where the threshold is and between people with and without disabilities using the Washington questions, but it's the whole range we want to look at, especially in different environmental contexts. People with only some difficulties in some areas might still face barriers, and that's what inclusion is all about. It's addressing everybody where they're at. And I also agree with Fred on the need for qualitative data. Quantitative data really tells us what the outcomes are, what the need is, but it's qualitative data that lets us know why things are the way they are and the why and the how of the dynamics of people's lives. I wanted to mention two important things. First is the Washington Group short set. It's a great tool, but it does under-identify children with developmental and psychosocial disabilities. It's not good for children under 5, and for children over 5, we know it misses some, and that's why the child functioning model was developed. If the Washington short set question is being used, that needs to be taken into account in the analysis, and if the child functioning module can be used, that's even better. The last point is that the importance of aligning disability data collection with the purpose for collection. The Washington Group short set and the child functioning module are very good for prevalence, for looking at patterns of prevalence, and for measuring exclusion by disaggregating outcome measures. It also can be very good for use for screening at intake. For example, intake at service delivery. There's a good example, the Site Savers project in India, where by using the Washington questions at intake, they were able to follow people who were coming for services and found that women with disabilities were not getting the same access to services as men with disabilities. So they were able to uncover that. The child functioning module in Fiji, in the Fiji Education Management Information System, is a very good example of how the disability questions can be used to refer children to services. The child functioning module, Washington short set, can identify people who have disabilities, but it is not good enough for, as Lorraine mentioned, for diagnosing conditions. It's not good enough for determining the eligibility for disability programs, and it's not detailed enough for designing services. If I'm going to be, if my project is providing glasses, just asking people whether they have difficulty seeing or not is not going to be accurate enough. So we have to think about why we're collecting the data and align the data collection tool with the purpose. And I could talk about it for a lot longer, but I'm trying to keep it to 3 minutes. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for some great questions and packed into 3 minutes. Ian, would you like to follow up with your response as well?
Yeah, thanks to Fred and Dan, and I'll obviously you've heard from me a bit already, so I'll try to keep short, Cameron. I mean, first, I suppose I'd say from representing DFID is that we're really pleased this work has gone ahead over the last 2 years since the Disability Summit, because clearly we were given the challenge by our government to step up, and it's really great to see that so many of the actors and organisations within the Girls Education Challenge have taken that initiative to really have these really rich and varied results and project presentations that have been shared today. And certainly that sort of theory of change, that you need good data to be able to recognise that there are disabled boys, girls, children, and that rich, nuanced information about what their functional impairments are, how they may be supported, is really the first step. Moving on to the project staff, how to build organisation and capacity awareness to take both steps that can benefit all children, but also adapt for the individuals. As I think Lorraine touched upon in her earlier presentation, we've got this really interesting variance in the data set, looking at the short questions with both an extended and an extended cutoff. With the extended cutoff, these really are larger volumes of individuals who really often have what may be described as invisible disabilities, where many things can make a difference. The point, I suppose, that we haven't got to so far, and I suppose this is a point for broader interest, is how this can impact upon government and national systems of inclusive education. Because to some extent, you have to take national decision makers, people like Fred Hagar in Kenya, and say, look, here is the data. This is the reason why we need to invest on these, for example, the district assessment and resource centres, having local centres of excellence that can be done for child referrals, to access adaptive and specific equipment, but also to be able to set, accommodations for students to support them through examination processes, and to really understand these different expectations. I thought the data from Zimbabwe, where you saw significantly lower levels of learning, at least at baseline, coming through the people for girls and children with hearing or cognitive impairments. These raise challenges about how we respond to them. But as I said, the idea that the data is the first step, and I think now we're really looking forward to having more detailed engagement, both with our projects that have this intensive support to disabled children with Leonard Cheshire and Cheshire Services in East Africa, but also right across the portfolio, and the support that they can then offer to the national governments in the country that we're working. Let me stop there. And I said we're really looking forward to some Q&A coming up. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our discussants for those interesting responses. Maybe to kick off the next discussion, I could just ask our presenters to respond on some of the points that Ian was raising around how the GEC projects can work with governments. And it also ties into a question which we had through the YouTube, which was how the GEC projects address the special education system, as is often still called, that is predominantly the solution to education for children with disabilities in low and middle income countries. So Lorraine, do you think you could come in with how GEC has been working with governments and with the existing special education systems or other inclusive education system, if that's what it's called in different countries?
Yes, I think one of the things that we're kind of hoping to do, I think, with all of the data is to provide some kind of evidence for advocacy. And I think that's touched on in several of the presentations, is that the invisibility of disability has been a problem up to this point. So going to government with ideas about, potentially what might need to be done has had more limited success in the past because there hasn't been the evidence or there hasn't been the demand. So what I think we're seeing with many of the GEC projects and hopefully with really responsive ministries of education like we have in Kenya, that it's possible to start using some of the experiences that we're generating to provide government with some potential things to discuss about, where do we put resources? How are we understanding what works in terms of improving educational outcomes and transition outcomes for children with these kind of marginalization factors? So I think we're just at the beginning of this journey, but I think in places like Kenya, where we've had particularly engaging relationships with ministries of education, it's led to some real progress, I think, but we are at the beginning of the journey.
Thank you. And I wonder if anyone would like to come in on the point that was raised by Fred and Dan about qualitative data and using qualitative data to understand why things are the way they are. Perhaps Mbuso, would you be able to come in on that point in the Zimbabwe context?
Yes, thank you. So just to add that in the Girls Education Challenge programs, so it is a requirement that all the data collection uses the mixed methods approach, and GC has provided guidance on how we collect this data, because as already shared, I mean, there's quite a number of projects that are there, and the whole idea as well is to make sure we manage the quality issues. So there's sort of like a standard way in terms of minimum requirements for using mixed methods data. So we have, I think the challenge has always been, obviously, when you are collecting data, you get driven by the outcomes that which you can quantify. But we are looking at doing studies. At the moment, we are limited to case studies of these different thematic areas, just to try and capture what's available. But I would like to agree as well with discussants that it's important to have qualitative data.
Thank you. So we had a question about using EGRA and EGMA for learning outcomes, and whether there are any floor effects in the EGRA and EGMA, that is scores, a kind of a clumping of scores towards the low end of the scale, and if that was the case, how was that dealt with? I don't know, Lorraine, would you be able to come in on that, or Mbuso?
I can go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a rigorous process that we go through. So we first, before we do any study, we'll do a calibration process, and in that calibration process, we take a sample of the girls in a typical setting where we're going to work with in, and that's a sample of around 100 girls, where we administer the EGRA and EGMA. So the calibration process really helps us in two dimensions. One is to make sure that the level of difficulty for the particular grade levels remains the same over time. And then also that we capture the ceiling and floor effects, where we don't have too many zeros and we don't have everyone scoring high as well. So through that calibration process, we have tried to manage the ceiling and floor effects, but at the same time, the subtasks are limited. So if you're doing grade 3 to grade 5, you can only do certain subtasks. And then if you're doing grade 5 to grade 7, then we keep adding the higher order tasks to manage the ceiling and floor effects. Thank you.
Thank you. And so we had a few questions around age group and the use of the Washington group questions for different ages and their suitability and their ability to pick up on a range of different types of disability. Lorraine, do you have an overall response to, on I guess, firstly, if you could clarify what age groups the girls were that the data were collected on, and also if you want to come in on in response to Dan's points about the Washington Group's short set of questions.
So a couple of things then. In terms of the age cohorts, the age ranged, generally speaking, from between sort of 12 to 18 years of age, but there is also particularly with the LNGB, the Leave No Girl Behind groups, we're also seeing girls who are younger than that. And in some instances, we're also seeing girls who are over the age of 18 as well. But generally speaking, the majority are sort of fit somewhere around sort of 10 to 12 up to 18. So in deciding what Washington Group set to use, some of this was expediency with GEC transition, the original one. And you'll notice that with the second program, LNGB, we have been using child functioning questions because we know that child functioning questions are going to be better at picking up impairments and difficulties in the sort of younger age range of the children in these samples. It was expedient for us to use the short set. It's not what we wanted to do, but we had a very limited window of opportunity when we came into the Girls Education Challenge program. A lot of the methodology was already fixed for school surveys, household surveys. So we had, I think probably people who are designing censuses also have the same problem. You have a limited amount of time in order to make the questionnaires doable. And because we came in very late to the discussion process, the only thing that we could really get away with is to say, right, at the very minimum, can we just make sure that you ask the Washington Group short set 6 questions? So it wasn't ideal, but overall we felt because the majority of girls were between 12 and 18, they were cognitively in a slightly better position to be able to answer the questions more in a more reliable way. We did stipulate at the time for girls for the GCT program that if half of their sample or more were below the age of 12, then they were to use the child functioning set. But that was very rare. So pretty much all of the projects use GCT projects use the short set, and it worked to an extent. But now what we're seeing with the LNGB program is what Dan is alluding to, really, is that we're seeing a broader range of potential difficulties showing up from the baseline information because we've been using the child functioning questions. So this is going to be very interesting as more of those baselines come in, we get more of the data, we'll get to be able to see whether using the child functioning questions is going to give us a much better, more reliable picture. So it's an evolving process.
Yeah, I think perhaps if I could just add a bit, Cameron. I mean, it was a real shame that in the first phase of GEC that ran from 2013, because at that point, many of the girls coming in would have been in the 6 to 10-year-old early primary age groups, where clearly the caregiver responses and there's that ability to identify young and do more support. But obviously the Girls Education Challenge has run for some time, and as I said, we really had this step up in action and interest to focus on the disability related data emerging in 2017-18 period. I mean, while the Zimbabwe project I think had mentioned there was relatively similar response rates, whether you ask questions about impairments to girls or directly to girls or to caregivers. That hasn't been the case in some other projects where typically you may see very large variations. And as I'm sure that Dan would also mention, these are some of the challenges when you try to compare prevalence rates between different geographies, different or asking questions to different stakeholders, and also people's understanding and perceptions. It's not always easy to read across between projects or localities, and certainly those much higher rates of issues, disabilities or impairments that come from the child functioning, especially in domains which map onto mental health issues such as making friends, anxiety, depression. In some areas in particular where the children have experienced acute stress, for example, in civil war and conflict, you may get a third of up to a third of children expressing anxiety, depression, etc. But obviously these tend to suggest for a more psychosocial response than perhaps some of the more traditional adaptations and support one would associate with inclusive education. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a number of other questions which we won't have time to address all of them, unfortunately, but maybe we'll just have one more before we wrap up. So let me maybe ask Lorraine. There are a couple of questions around the adaptations for individual learners. So I think there's maybe a question around the range of responses that the projects have used to address inclusion and to improve inclusion, and the extent to which those have included specific strategies for individual children and their needs. And have the projects been able to address those? So have they been able to kind of gear learning towards individual learners?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so what happened with the data disaggregation is that projects that had previously not realized that disabled girls were necessarily in their cohorts suddenly had to start thinking about how to make their interventions accessible. So as I think Mbuso was saying, and I think also in Mike's presentation, there were limitations to what they could suggest and do initially for girls, because their budgets were sort of already being used, so they had to be quite creative in what they were doing. But what we have always tried to do with GEC is to focus on barriers, not to focus necessarily on impairments. So that the system, the school itself, the system, the teachers, the curriculum becomes accessible to all girls with disabilities, all children with disabilities. So we've been trying to encourage projects as far as possible to think about the institutional, attitudinal, environmental barriers, which they can not having necessarily to target individual interventions to individual children. So that it doesn't become an individualized thing too much, in the sense that, then it would only apply to this cohort of girls, and what happens if a child with a completely different impairment comes into the classroom, in the next year, the teachers find they can't cope. So what we've tried to do is encourage projects to think from a barrier perspective as far as possible. But there are projects who have then taken that a step further. They have gone much more in depth into looking at the specific challenges that some of their specific girls have. And there have been interventions which have included provision of assistive technology, looking at additional time with particular groups of girls, so after school clubs, trying to improve reading, that kind of thing, so providing a little bit of extra time, looking at adapting some of the testing materials so that girls with specific impairments have a slightly more accessible way of doing some of the tests. There have also been attempts to link what we're seeing in places like Kenya with their education assessment resource centres, is linking girls who have been identified by projects to these assessment centres. So there's a referral process happening. So as far as possible, that's the kind of thing that we've been encouraging, so that it's not a project providing things, but it's about a project creating links and networks, so that it's many different girls can access these kind of services. And also, as I said in my presentation, helping to put demand on the services so that the services can grow as a consequence of the demand being placed on them. So those are the kind of things that are working at the moment. But we are just coming into the midlines now, where projects are as Mbuso said, in Zimbabwe, looking at what they've done initially. Is that enough? Do they have to think about doing something a little bit more detailed? So these are going to be very interesting questions coming up as a result of midlines now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. And on that note, we are over our original time, and we will wrap up. So I'd just like to thank all of our presenters very much for joining, and to thank all of our participants online. Thank you especially for bearing with us during the technical hitches we've been going through today, and thanks to our translator and captioner who have been translating and captioning during this session. So I think we've had a lot about the Washington Group questions today. For those who are interested in understanding more about the Washington Group question set and how that can be used, in the resources that will circulate after this meeting, you'll see there are some links to our previous webinars in this series, and also other resources where you can find out how those work. And it's really kind of a great, I think, practical resource to see how the Girls' Education Challenge and increasingly other projects are using those questions, which have their limitations, and there are also other question sets that can be used, but are also extremely useful in providing this kind of disaggregated data. And I think the projects have highlighted how this new disaggregated data is actually making people aware, in some cases for the first time, of the prevalence of disability and of the needs of children with disabilities, and perhaps kind of highlighting just how much there is to do in order to meet the needs of all learners. But nevertheless, we're very, I think, happy and inspired to see these projects starting to use this data and starting to be more serious about addressing disability inclusion. So with that, thank you very much to everyone. And as I said, we will circulate resources on this after this webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.